Hello. We are about to continue into the next chapter of Woods Runner by Gary Pawson. We just left Samuel in a tight situation last chapter where he discovered that the fire he saw from the distance was actually all of the cabins in his settlement being burned. And when he arrived, he found several dead bodies of the residents and just completely mutilated and everything on fire. Luckily, he did not find his parents while he buried and said words to those who had been slain, including the men, women, and children who he knew who had lived there. So now he is determined to find his parents, who he knows has been captured. Chapter 5. Let's see what happens. Samuel was just 13, but he lived on a frontier where even when things were normal, someone his age was 13 going on 30. Childhood ended when it was possible to help with chores. For a healthy boy or girl, it ended at 8 or 9, possibly 10. Because of his parents' nature, their lack of physical skills, their joy and gentleness, their love of books and music, their almost childlike wonder in knowing all they could about the whole wide world, but not necessarily the world right around them, Samuel had become the provider for his family. As he embraced the forest, his skill at hunting grew. Actually, the forest embraced him, took him in, taught him, made him, as the French said, a coureur du bois, a woods runner. Soon he provided meat for nearly the whole settlement, and in turn the other men and women helped Samuel's parents with their small farm and took over Samuel's chores when he was in the woods. Samuel's knowledge grew until when he heard a twig break, he would know whether it was a deer or bear or squirrel that broke it. He could look at a track and know when the animal or man made it, and whether or not the creature was in a hurry, and if so, why, and how fast it was going, and what, if anything, was chasing it, and how close the pursuer might be. And the more he was in the woods of the wild, the more he was of the woods of the wild, of the green, the less he was of the people. He sometimes enjoyed being with others, and of course he loved his parents. But his skills and his woods knowledge set him apart, made him different. His neighbors in the settlement saw him and saw this and sought him out when they had a question about the forest or about game. They marveled at him, thought of him as a kind of seer, one who could know more than others, divine things in a spiritual way. Samuel knew this was not the case. He had just learned to see what others could not. Now he broke to the fore of all his knowledge to read the sign as he met the day. He was on his feet before the first light broke. Through the trees he woke desperately thirsty and went to the creek that trickled past the rear of the cabin, and he drank long and hard. The water was cold, it hurt his teeth, and so sweet it took some of the taste stink from the evening before out of his mouth. He was hungry, but he could find no food that the marauders had overlooked. He would have to shoot something along the way. For now, there was nothing to do but read sign and try to figure out what had happened, how it had happened, and exactly when. He started by circling the cabin, forcing himself to take time to be calm, carefully studying the ground, looking closely at the soft dirt away from the grass. First, he found small tracks from the moccasins he had made for his mother. Then he saw his father's prints, also from moccasins, the right foot toed in slightly from a time when, showing off as a small boy, he'd broken his ankle jumping from the shed roof. Both sets of prints were in the soft dirt in front of the door of the cabin, in the normal patterns they would make going in or out. Then, in the dirt at the side of the cabin, more moccasin prints. Larger, flatter feet digging deeper, running as the attackers came, and still more prints. Too many to tell them apart. On top of those, which meant they had come later, hard shoes with leather soles and heels. At least 3 men with regular shoes. 2 of normal weight and 1 heavier. On top of all the marks, Samuel saw horse prints. 2, maybe 3 horses, all unshod and being led because they had no extra weight on them. No men in the settlement wore shoes or could afford a horse to ride. Only 1 man had a single workhorse. Others who could afford animals had oxen, because when they became too old or broken to work, they could be eaten. The attack had been fast. They had come up along the creek. Samuel backtracked and found their prints in the soft soil there, and exploded out in the clearing by the cabin. His parents were probably outside and must have been overrun with no time to react. His father wouldn't have had his musket close anyway. It was like him to leave it inside when working near the house. Samuel's father had seen bad things happen to other people, but was too good inside, too generous to believe they could happen to him. He must believe now, Samuel thought. He must believe that anything can happen. The attack widened rapidly. He saw where Overton and the others had fallen, saw the blood now covered with flies where they had been hacked to the ground with tomahawks. It was a mystery to Samuel, though, why his parents had not been killed. He was grateful, but it didn't make any sense. He lost their tracks as he followed the spreading attack. Larger moccasin prints and the shoe prints of the 3 men were everywhere. He could imagine the terror of the people in the settlement, the war cries of the attackers mixed with the screams of the victims and the smell of blood and fear and death. He saw where at least 2 of the men in shoes had mounted their horses. Here and there he found single or double tracks of his mother and father as they were jerked or pulled. The tracks scuffed and misshapen. New tracks joined theirs as other people were also spared, all of them dragged or pushed towards the eastern side of the settlement. Finally, he saw how it ended. The last of the cabins were burned, their surviving victims, probably neck-tied to each other with rope, lined up and pulled along the trail. The horses were in front and the attackers split, some in front and some in back. There was no indication that any prisoners had been wounded or killed. When had it happened? He started following the tracks, which a blind man could have followed, and let his mind work on that question. He left home early that day before moving west until he came to new country, since he'd hunted out in their forest around the settlement. Say by mid-morning, he was out of earshot of gunfire, if anybody had used a gun. All the victims he buried had been chopped down with either tomahawks or war clubs. So, the attack could have come mid-morning. That would have been the soonest. If that was the case, they were just under 24 hours ahead of him, maybe 22. Moving slowly, as they would with prisoners, they might make 2 miles an hour. With a rest of perhaps 6 hours, they might have traveled 14 to 16 hours. 24 to 28 miles. He shook his head. Probably less. He studied the trail ahead and the spacing of the footprints, trying to estimate their speed. They were close together. Even the horses' tracks showed that they were moving slowly, 20 miles at the most. Yet, still only a guess. But he turned out wrong. Later he discovered he'd forgotten that there was another settlement of 4 cabins 10 miles further on, and the attackers had taken time to stop and slaughter the people who lived there. So, that concludes chapter 5. And that was just as intense as the last chapter. He used his amazing tracking skills to try and figure out what had happened and when and where. I think it's pretty incredible that he could point out his family's feet and then determine how many attackers there were. some in moccasins, some in regular shoes. And back then, no one who chose to live on the frontier could afford regular shoes, especially in his settlement. So I really like seeing him do his work like that. And it seems that they are much closer than he anticipated, so pretty soon Samuel could be running into the people who attacked his settlement. Now there is another fact sheet at the back. It's called The British. Generally poor trained, the British enlisted soldiers, let me start over. The British. Generally poor trained, the British enlisted soldier was also poorly paid, often going months with no pay at all, poorly cared for. The wounded were virtually ignored and allowed to die alone unless a friend had time to help. AKA, if you were gonna die, it was better to have a friend shoot you. Poorly fed. Salted beef, dried peas, and tea were mainstays. And poorly treated. Tied to a wagon wheel and flogged until his back was shredded for the slightest infraction. And yet, somehow, amazingly, up until the War for Independence, he managed to conquer most of the world. Guess who? King George. Young British officers in England, when they were being shipped out to fight in the colonies, were told to settle your affairs and make out a proper will, because the riflemen will almost certainly kill you. So I think the biggest advantage that the British Army had against patriots was their numbers. Like, there were more British soldiers to die and stand in the way in between American freedom. And I mean, they were treated terribly, so they were probably pretty weak too, especially because not many loyalists are there to give you sustenance or food. So that was pretty interesting. We also saw that some of them are wearing moccasins and they're using tomahawks. So, like, maybe they're out of bullets. Who knows? And we will read the next 2 chapters next time. Bye, guys. Don't forget to take notes.